Dr. Rejman, the next meeting, the fifth meeting of the ACVSB was January 1990. Can we just look at one of the documents that was prepared for the meeting before we look at the minutes? NHBT 40/189_001. This is paper 5 of 6 for the ACVSB, cost-benefit hepatitis C screening of blood donors in the UK. If we just go to the next page, just so that you can recognise the document. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of this, but that's the document. It continues for 3 pages. If we go back to the first page, just wanted to ask you about the first paragraph. But before I do so, my understanding from the surrounding documents is that this is the paper that you wrote and that then Dr. Pickles made some amendments to, and then I think it was Dr. Pickles who spoke to it at the meeting.
I don't know. My understanding from the papers is that it's Dr. Pickles' document, not mine.
Okay.
Because, I mean, say, looking at the wording, etc., it doesn't seem the sort of wording that I would have used.
Right, well, let me just show you one other document, but maybe then I can pick up the questions about the substance of it with Dr. Pickles. DHSC 0003545_004. DHSC 303545_004. This is Dr. Pickles saying, I've reworked Dr. Rejman's paper into something that might be possible for the ACVSB. So you had some involvement in it, but
I think I provided some of the background, and I think that there was a sort of a very scruffy, without heading or anything, just bits and pieces, which I think was there, and I think that Dr. Pickles based her paper on that. Obviously, the point is that if one provides background, it is up to the author, the final author, to decide how much of that is appropriate, how much of that they agree with, because obviously Dr. Pickles is entitled to her own views, which may not always be the same as mine. So, you know, in a sense, the final document she takes ownership of, whereas I might well have contributed a lot of the background.
That's fine. My question was about the introductory part of it, so I'll ask Dr. Pickles tomorrow. So let's go straight to the meeting of the 17th of January 1990, PRSE 0001477. There's a detailed discussion which begins at the bottom of the second page. I'm not going to take you through the detail of it, Dr. Rejman, but we can see it begins with Dr. Gunson speaking to one of his papers. If we go over the page, we can see at paragraph 16, the chair poses the question or invites the committee to address the question of whether the time has now come for the introduction of routine hepatitis C screening. There is then various contributions recorded, which I won't take you through. Maybe that there are differences of view to some extent from the various members. But if we pick it up over the bottom of the next page, please. If we zoom in on the last 2 paragraphs, Paul. So paragraph 28 refers to the funding having to be found from the existing health vote allocation. And then paragraph 29, Chair summed up the general consensus of the committee. Routine testing should not be introduced in advance of the FDA decision. Top of the next page. Scientifically, not enough is known yet, but there is agreement that the test does detect some people who will transmit. And the overall prevalence figure of non-A, non-B following blood transfusion for the UK may be 10,000 per annum, subject to very wide margins of error. There's then the chair asking members for their opinions as to what action should be taken, and then there's a reference to a view of Dr. Tedder, and then there's a committee agreeing, is this right? They're going to look at costs, And then the third bullet point, the committee could give no further scientific advice at this point, but would discuss the matter further at the next meeting, which would be after the International Hepatitis meeting in Houston. And then there's reference to Dr. Pickles speaking to paper ACBSB 5/6. Do you have either any recollection now or any informed view, having looked back at the papers for the purposes of giving your evidence, as to why it was that the committee was apparently unwilling to give what's described here as no further scientific advice, but not yet grasp the nettle and take a decision, why it wanted to await the meeting in Houston that's referred to?
Well, I think this is January 1990?
This is January 1990. Yes.
Right. Okay, and the first chiron test was when? April, May 1989? Something like that.
I'm not going to
it is something
you,
of that sort,
right.
but anyway, 6 months before this, roughly speaking, give or take. I think that, in essence, there was enough disquiet about false positives and false negatives and not having a confirmatory test, even at this early stage. Now, I know that Dr. Mortimer at the beginning said this sounds as though this is a test that we could introduce, and various people at various times said, yes, it's obviously doing something. But I think committee members seem to be of the few that there were too many doubts, to put it bluntly. And that is my reading now. Now, obviously, it wasn't my decision, it was a committee decision, and the committee obviously would have decided. I don't think at the time there was anybody, Dr. Canavan, I suspect, had no view. They might have said, do you have a view? Should we really be pushing for this? And I suspect that my answer to that would have been, look, I'm not an expert virologist remotely, not at all. All that I'm doing is I'm bringing together papers, I'm trying to bring together the best information I can for the committee to make a judgment. Don't ask me, you have to ask the committee. And if the committee feels that despite our best efforts at giving them all the data we have, that they still are not sure, then that is it.
Let's pick matters up then at the next meeting, the sixth meeting, April 1990, NHBT 5072_098. Second page, please, Paul. We can see there paragraph 8 under the heading Hepatitis C refers to the Ortho Symposium, and there's a reference to paper ACBSB 6.2. The abstracts from this symposium had been circulated with the Secretariat's comments. Dr. Rejman said the overall impression was that the test was not sensitive or specific enough for reliable testing. Confirmatory tests, more information about the significance of positive test results were needed before the Ortho test could be used for the routine screening of healthy donors. And then there's a reference to Dr. Mortimer, and the discussion continues. I wanted to ask you just about your own contribution here. Now, this reads as though you're not simply repeating what the symposium says, but you're providing your own comments on it.
Yes, and I think I've actually mentioned in my report to the Penrose inquiry, and definitely in my third statement here, that the quote there about what I said is not exactly what is said on the front page of that report. Because my recollection, I'd have to check the exact wording, is that the overall impression confirmed by informal discussion with others was. So it was not just my view, it was the view of other people that I had spoken to at that meeting. And then later on at this meeting, both Professor Zuckerman and Dr. Mortimer, who were both at that meeting, said the same thing, that the tests were not sensitive, the test was not sensitive or specific enough for reliable testing, and they confirmed that.
And if we just go to PRSC 0004275, this is the paper referred to in the minutes, report on Ortho HCV Symposium, and then the summary, we append the Ortho abstracts recently received and supplementary notes. The overall impression, and here's the reference to informal discussion, Dr. Rejman, reinforced by informal discussion with delegates, is that the test is not sensitive or specific enough, and in the absence of appropriate confirmatory testing is unable to give data upon which appropriate clinical decision-making can be reliably based.
Yes, so I think that I was basically reporting, I'd been to this meeting, which I think was a whole day meeting, and obviously one chats to people during breaks and during lunch, etc. And having spoken to other people that I knew, you know, from elsewhere, they were of the same opinion as to this being the overall impression.
Is it your evidence, Dr. Rejman, that you're simply relaying what was being said to you and relaying that to the ACVSB, or was it your own view that was shared by others that you were relaying to the ACVSB?
Well, I was at the meeting, so therefore I heard what people said, and this particular paper is about 32 pages long because it contains the abstracts of all the talks, and with most of the talks there's a covering sheet from me giving additional information to what is in the abstract. So when somebody in the Penrose inquiry said it was a brief paper, I don't accept that. This was a detailed paper giving information from a meeting that I had been asked to attend by ACVSB and to report back on that meeting, which is what this is. This is a report back on that meeting, and if one is going to report back, people are bound to ask, well, what did you come away with? As a non-expert, non-virologist, not claiming to be either of those, what was your general view? And that is what I have given.
Now, you're aware, obviously, from your statement to the Penrose inquiry, that there was also Dr. Bolton who reported upon or produced his own notes of the same meeting. I'm not going to take you through those. But can I just ask you to look at Dr. Bolton's letter to Professor Cash? You wouldn't have seen it at the time, but obviously you saw it, I think, when you were writing your statement to Penrose. Yes,
I saw it for the first time when the Penrose inquiry wrote to me with their Article 13 or whatever.
So PRSC 0001562. And then in the second paragraph, Dr. Bolton says, could I just add that in spite of obvious difficulties with the current Ortho ELISA assay, I have developed a very strong feeling that the screening of donors for HCV antibodies should be introduced at the earliest possible opportunity. This is not because of the science, but because there appears to be little doubt that people have contracted HCV as a result of transfusions, which they would not have received had those transfusions been screened for HCV antibody. And then he goes on to talk about the concerns about future litigation and so on. Now, within the department, you, Dr. Canavan, Dr. Metters, Dr. Pickles, others discussing this, considering this issue, within the ACVSB, was the decision about introducing screening ever looked at from this perspective? Not on the basis of this letter, of course, but from this perspective, the simple yet principled point, there are all sorts of potential problems and difficulties, but ultimately we can stop people being infected to some extent if we introduce screening now.
Well, it was not up to the department, number one. The department was not going to introduce this test off its own back. It couldn't, because it would have to justify it, if nothing else, to the people that pay for the costs of testing. So if the department were to go out on the loom and say, we're going to introduce this testing, then obviously the RHAs would say, well, okay, fair enough, and you will pay us for it, for everything, the cost of the test, the cost of manpower, any downside to us which is caused by this. And I cannot, well, I don't know, obviously I haven't been in the department, I wasn't in the department that long, but it would be a very odd thing to happen for a department to, you know, go against advice of a committee that was set up to give it that particular advice. I think with this letter from Professor Bolton, I think the importance is the word science in inverted commas. He obviously is not interested in false positives, false negatives, confirmation, or anything. All that he is saying is that if we apply this test, some people will not get HCV. But I would put it to you that if you were to take every 200th donation and just bin it, you would reduce the incidence of HCV by chance. So I think the thing is that he is actually, his letter contains no science at all. His main factor is the litigation, which I think is the bottom bit, which I think is the driving force. And also, I would put it to you that his report of the meeting is nowhere near as detailed as mine. And I think in my statement, I put forward the idea that if you have two people attending the same meeting, they may well produce a completely different report. And I gave an example of a meeting that Harold Gunson had attended and Ruth van Mintshaw had attended. And if you look at their two reports, there are significant differences.
As I say, I'm not going to take time with comparing the two reports. No doubt that the chair can do so
May I
as required.
just ask one thing?
Yes.
Can I understand what the basis is for your saying that if you were to take every 200th donation and bin it, you would reduce the incidence of hepatitis C? It might be thought that if the incidence, let us suppose, just for the sake of the argument, is 1%,
Yes.
that you don't know whether the 200th donation is in 1 or 99.
No, but that is the whole point with false positives, because with the false positives, 90% of the original screening tests were incorrect. Only 10% of the positives were true, and I've given details about that in my statement. So what it means is that if you take 100 donations, if you test all of them for Hep C, you would get whatever proportion, 0.6% would be positive under the first screening system, and they would therefore be counted as positives, but only 1/10 of those were actually truly positive. So in a sense, it's not far from being just a random choice.
But the fact would be, would it not, that you would actually, although you would produce a number of false positives, you would actually exclude things which were positive, and if you caught 10% of those, you would reduce the infection rate by 10%. Well,
that's correct, and if you want to abolish all infection, you don't give any blood transfusions.
Yes,
well, no, that is the corollary. Ultimately, that is the thing, and this is what the discussion is about. We need a transfusion service. We need donors so that recipients can have the blood. And the whole problem with the false positives was, what do you say to donors? Now, originally, at the beginning, the assumption was that we only had 50% false positives. Now, the true figure was we had 90% false positives, which is way in excess of what would be acceptable in most circumstances. And we don't know how many false negatives there were. There obviously were some false negatives, judging by the fact that some people who were tested for Hep C with the original tests did transmit non-A, non-B, hepatitis C. So I think what you have to look at is the broader picture in a sense and say, look, we need these transfusions. What we need is a test that will give us two things: confidence in the validity of the test. What does it mean? Secondly, it isn't going to decimate our donor population, because if you're throwing out 9/10 of your donors that you're excluding on this test are people that you could have used, then that is reducing your blood supply quite significantly. So I think, you know, there are all sorts of aspects to this, and I think that the committee was well aware of this, even though, as I say, initially they thought the number of false positives was significantly less than it proved to be. So I think, you know, we're faced with a situation that you have a test which a lot of people, significant numbers of people, say is a defective test. Now, I'm not sure whether they're going to discuss this business about other countries and everything, are we?
Next question.
We will do. Okay, right, fine. So we'll leave that for later. But basically, that would be my point.
Yes, well, I think I understand what you would have thought at the time. So
thank you.
And just for the transcript, the reference for Dr. Bolton's report from the symposium is PRSE 0004402. If we can return to the minutes of the 6th meeting, NHBT 5072_098, and turn to page 3. We can see, if we go to the bottom 2 paragraphs on the page, please. Paragraph 21, the chair reporting that France, Belgium and Luxembourg had introduced routine screening and Italy had introduced the test on a voluntary basis. Now, what we don't pick up from the minutes, Dr. Rejman, and as you yourself have observed, the minutes are not a full account of the discussion. What we don't pick up is what weight was given to that, whether there was any discussion about that, whether there was any concern expressed about the UK lagging behind. Do you have any recollection either as to what the committee thought about the significance of screening being introduced in other countries, or whether there were any discussions within the department that you can recall on the significance of those facts?
Well, I don't, as you say, this is just a statement from the chairman saying something that I presume John Canavan and I would have known anyway. So it wasn't news to us. I think probably it was not news to Harold Gunson and Ruthven Mitchell. It might have been, well, of the virologists, I suspect most of those would have known. The people that wouldn't have known would have been, for example, the general haematologist and possibly one or two others. So I'm not sure how much of that was new information for people or just really a statement of fact. Look, other countries are introducing this, so we need to sort of bear that in mind type of thing. And I think that would have been the end of it.
And then we can see bottom of the page, the chair remarking science seemed to have advanced little. Still questions whether the anti-HCV test was reliable and a useful step forward or created too many problems at this stage. If we go over the page, again, I'm not going to go through the detail of each of the individual contributions, and we have the minutes. We can pick up at the bottom paragraph, the chair's summing up of the discussion. Inadequate scientific data to support the introduction of the Ortho test. We need a confirmatory test. FDA not yet approved the test would be reassuring if the regulatory authority in the country of origin had done so. Need to learn more about donor panels and significance of positive reaction. And then there's reference to there being a prospective study proposed involving 25 to 50,000 donors to generate sufficient positives for confirmatory testing. Top of the next page. We can see there's then reference to a protocol for the pilot study, reference to a paper by the Economic Advisors Office, and a note's going to be prepared for ministers. So still no recommendation for the introduction of anti-HCV screening. It may be said, it may well be submitted in due course, looking at the stage we'd reached so far, April 1990, that the ACVSB and or the department we're not approaching this with a sufficient sense of urgency, of looking at it from the pure public health perspective of what lives could be saved or transmissions of hepatitis C could be prevented. What would you say, if anything, in response to that?
Well, I think I've actually mentioned in my third statement that one of the problems with the false positives was actually what you do with donors. And we'll go on to this when we talk about other countries, etc. But basically, in this country, sorry, well, I'll talk about that later on. But in essence, the problem was that the committee felt that there were too many downsides to this test. And as I've said earlier, you know, if the test is not doing its job, then, you know, if by chance you just happen to be reducing the number of infections, well, as I said, you know, what is the purpose of using the test? And I think the committee looked at it, and the committee, at the end of the day, the committee are the experts. They looked at it and they said that at that stage there was insufficient there. They felt that the FDA giving it approval would at least sort of be something, although, as I've said earlier, FDA is not always so wonderful. And so that was an impediment at this stage, and they basically were not happy with the test.
If we go on then 2 months to the 22nd of June 1990, yes, by which time FDA approval had been given, there's a memo from you to Dr. Metters, LHBT 5061_148. Second paragraph, you referred to a conversation with Dr. Mortimer. Third paragraph, you set out some matters relating to the available tests. You refer to a Lancet report and so on. You then set out a number of other matters in paragraphs 4, 5 and 6. 6, you summarise a table from a paper that you had come across. And then you say this by way of summary. In summary, it would appear that screening of blood donations for hepatitis C is of benefit to recipients, but could pose major problems to donors who might be incorrectly labelled as being at risk of developing chronic non-A non-B hepatitis themselves, with all the implications of counselling, top of the next page, gastroenterology follow-up and reduced ability to obtain life insurance endowment policies, etc. And then you give some suggested figures. Now, is it correct to read this minute, and in particular what you say in paragraph 7, as expressing your assessment? You're not simply here reporting somebody else's, are you?
I probably would have discussed it with John Canavan, almost certainly. He's a copy recipient. Who else I would have discussed it with? I may well have discussed it with Dr. Pickles. I do not know. I think what I'm basically saying there, and this is actually on the basis of the initial test, which in fact was actually 9/10 of that 0.6%, in fact, were false positives. So it's only a tenth of that 0.6% that is actually true positives. But I think what I'm basically saying is, yes, there may be benefit to recipients, and one thing that one has to bear in mind is that hepatitis C was much, much less common in the UK than it was in the US and various other countries, particularly in Southern Europe, where there was a much higher incidence. So we're talking here about small numbers of positives, and from the point of view of the recipients, I can't remember what the figures are, that 50% of recipients would be dead within a year or two of having had the transfusion. So one looks, and obviously therefore they are not going to get chronic hepatitis and cirrhosis and liver cancer. And also the other thing is, I can't remember what the figures are, whether it's about 20 or 25% of, 50% of recipients could go on to some form of chronic hepatitis, which might be just chronic persistent as opposed to chronic aggressive hepatitis. A proportion would go on to cirrhosis. A very small proportion will go on to liver cancer. So one's talking about smaller and smaller and smaller numbers. And the question really is, if one did anything that would damage the donor base, then this would be a very major problem.
I'll pick up on some of the themes in relation to false positives and donors once we finish going through the documents. But let's move then to the meeting that took place shortly after your minute. So meeting of the 2nd of July 1990, PRSE 40976. And if we go to the next page, we can see it's the 7th meeting, 2nd of July. Bottom of the page, you're asked to summarise the course of events since the last meeting, and so we can pick up from this: FDA approval, America's introduced screening, other countries following, and more studies have been carried out, Ribo available as a supplementary test. The meeting brought forward so a decision on the introduction of hepatitis C testing could be reached. So that's your update as I read the minutes.
Yes.
Over the next page, paragraph 6 reports the chair saying, in terms of the purpose of the meeting, it's to reconsider the principle of hepatitis C screening. Secondary purpose, look at the draft protocol, decide which tests to use. There's then contributions from Professor Zuckerman and Dr. Gunson. Paragraph 8, after further discussion, the committee concluded they should recommend to ministers that hepatitis C screening should be introduced in the UK, but that first a pilot study using the Ortho and Abbott tests was necessary to decide which was the better test for the regional transfusion centres. Now, again, and then the discussion continues further in relation to that, in particular that latter point. This is what's been described elsewhere, and I think probably clear from the purpose of, from the face of the minutes, as the decision in principle. The ACVSB are now saying, yes, we should definitely introduce this.
Yes.
But the actual introduction is deferred effectively, pending now a decision as to which of the tests to be used.
Well, my reading of this, and as I say, it's a long time ago, is that by that stage you had two tests, a competitor test, because it's never a good idea if you just have one test, unless that test is infallible and guaranteed and is 100%, gives the correct result all the time, secondly, is user-friendly to all the RTCs, then one probably wouldn't go for a single test. By this stage, there's a second test, and therefore one has a choice as to which of them gives more accurate results or more true results, and also which one is feasible to use in the context of a transfusion service, because obviously this is an additional test on top of already their hepatitis B, their HIV, I don't know whether they do a syphilis. You know, there are various tests that they're doing, and this is yet another addition to that. And the thing is to look at the practicalities of introducing it, because I think when it came to some other countries, particularly, for example, the US, if you're talking about tests for the commercial side of blood products, you know, costs a little bit more, you just put the price up of your product, and that is it. And so therefore they're not worried about practicalities, and also they're not particularly worried about donors or donors being upset about being told that the donors might be upset, particularly if the donor is relying upon that as a source of income, if they're told that they can't donate, but then they might go to yet another place to give their blood.
Why not at this stage? And what I'm asking for is your understanding of what the committee's thinking was at the time, or your understanding of what the department's thinking was at the time. Why not say, given that the decision in principle has been taken, just say, get on with it. The regional transfusion centres, one can use one test, one can use the other, and then we can look at it in 4 to 6 months' time and see whether we now recommend that they should focus on one and not the other. Why not just crack on?
Well, ultimately, the department is guided by the experts on the committee. The experts on the committee, which included people at the sharp end. So in fact, it had 2 people from the transfusion service who would have been presumably in a position to say how reasonable would it be to just introduce the test on that basis. Now, they knew that there was going to be a significant number. Originally, we thought it was only 50% false positives. Later on, we found out it was 90% false positives. They knew that they were going to be stuck with false positives. Now, we'll go into other countries, etc. But basically, in the UK, if you ask a donor to come, if you invite a donor to come and give blood, they come of their own free will. There is no pressure on them. They're not compelled to do it. What you're giving them is a biscuit and a cup of tea. That is it. So you're not paying them, so there's nothing to encourage them for any other reason. So they're coming of their own goodwill. They're doing it as a contribution to the public welfare. So to then say to these people, we've tested you and you've come up positive. Now, the first thing is, what do you say to that person? Because the doctors in the transfusion centres wanted to be honest with their donors. They wanted to say to them, look, for example, if you go back, for example, to HIV, if you tested them and they come back HIV positive, well, first of all, you see them confidentially and you say to them, look, we've tested your blood and it's come up HIV positive. Do you know, is there any reason why you might be HIV positive? And then they may say, well, actually, they're homosexual or they're a drug abuser or they were in the past or whatever. Some reason, there may be no reason. But anyway, you say to them, look, unfortunately, we found you're HIV positive. And the impact of this is you have to be careful about sexual relationships so as not to pass it on to anybody. At that time, obviously, well, I'm not sure exactly when AZT came on board, but there would have been the start of some form of treatment available, so they could have referred them to infectious diseases unit. So therefore, the donor has had some benefit from being told that they're positive. In this case, you have a donation which comes up positive, and you say to the donor, you've come up positive, but we don't know actually whether you're truly positive or whether this is a duff result. We don't know. And the donor is going to say, but you're the experts, you know about this, you sort it. Well, I can't sort it because I don't know. And it's a difficulty because, you see, once one donor has that, they tell their friends and they tell their friends, and before you know where you are, the number of your donors goes down significantly. And I think that is a very, very important concept to bear in mind.
Dr. Rejman, you've been at pains to point out that you are not a member of the committee,
no.
And your role was the role you described of being the medical secretary. But it might be said, listening to your evidence, that it was a topic upon which at the time you had very strong and firm views. Is that fair? No.
I would say I was aware of the concerns of the transfusion service because they were made clear to us. You know, Dr. Gunson and others said to us, you know, what the problems were. So what I'm doing here is I'm recounting to you what I was told at the time. I had no view, and anyway, even if I had a view, it would be of no relevance because I did not work in the transfusion service. I had no contact with donors. Therefore, everything I say to you is a report of what I was told by others.
Let's just move on then to the 8th meeting, 21st of November 1990, NHBT 5073_018. I think we can go straight to the Chair's summary of the discussion, page 4, paragraph 18. where the chairman summed up the discussion by saying that there was agreement that the UK should introduce hepatitis C testing as soon as practicable. RTCs would decide individually whether to use Ortho or Abbott test. So the decision in principle has shifted now in the sense there's a greater degree of urgency. It's now as soon as practicable.
Yes.
And indeed, the choice is now to be left to RTCs as to which test to use.
Yes, because I think by this stage, I think we'd had the results of the first pilot comparing the two tests. And generally speaking, my understanding is that there wasn't much to tell between them. The interesting thing was that the repeat positives for one test were not always repeat positives for the other test. So which test was better, we couldn't know. And I think Dr. Gunson, in his report from that first screening, said that the supplementary, and I think what he meant was confirmatory testing, would be the arbiter. And so what we were saying here is that if people were positive, then presumably you would go on to REBA, which was the original, the REBA 1. And then I can't remember exactly when well, actually it says here to all PCR, so we're already talking about PCR. PCR was the gold standard for telling whether a test was a true positive. Tells you nothing about true negatives, only tells you about true positives. And the PCR was available, so presumably, even at this stage, what I think is being suggested here is that if you have a donation that is repeat positive, that means you do the test once, comes up positive, you then repeat a test on that same sample and it comes up positive, so it's repeat positive, you then do either the REBA or you do the REBA and the PCR to confirm, and those that are confirmed as positive, those you can then tell the donor, look, I'm very sorry, we found out that you've got hepatitis C. Now, we don't know how long you've had it for, we don't know why. We're not asking you why you're positive. That's nothing to do with us. We're just telling you this. And from then on, you could refer them to a gastroenterologist and various other people.
Now, the ACVSB, having said in November of 1990 that the screening should be introduced as soon as practicable,
yes,
we know that with the exception of Newcastle, it wasn't introduced until I think, September of 1991.
Yes.
Do you recall being yourself troubled or concerned about that delay?
Well, I think people in the department, and I think there's a minute there from Hilary Pickles when she was talking about the introduction originally in July 1991. I mean, so reading that minute, she obviously was concerned, and she said, well, look, you know, Harold Gunson has said the earliest we can possibly do it is July 1991. And I think that there was concern, but ultimately, as it says there, it's as soon as practicable. That means as soon as it can actually be put into action. And the delays, I don't know. I mean, say one would have to, say there was that ACTD summary of the history of hepatitis C screening. I think you've come across that, where they actually put in all the various stages between the recommendation from November 1990 and the final introduction in September 1990. You've got that document, haven't you? Yes,
I think so, yes.
So they've actually explained that Harold Gunson went to the RTC directors asking them how quickly can they actually get their show on the road, and they got various replies and they agreed at a particular date. And then the problem then was that there was a second generation of hepatitis C tests that came out, and the first generation were going to be got rid of. So therefore we'd only have the second generation. So therefore it was suggested that probably a good idea to try out the second generation, because nobody had evaluated the second generation tests at all anywhere. So it was suggested if we can check to see how these second generation tests work, how practicable are they, do they work, are their results better? And the idea was that the second generation would generate a lot fewer false positives, which obviously would have the benefit that you would be able to, well, probably the most important benefit is that if you had a more accurate test, it meant that you had a higher number of donations that you could make available quickly. That means, you know, people like platelets, which might need to be given within a matter of hours or whatever. So you could do that much better if you've got a better test available. So I think all this worked through, and there were various reasons why things sort of took longer than ideally they should have done. And I think people in the department were anxious that, in fact, that the test should come on board as soon as possible. But in the end, it was a case of what the transfusion service could actually manage.
You're right that it was the 9th meeting, I don't think we need to look at it, on the 25th of February 1991, PRSE 302280, I think, or alternatively, we don't need to pull this up, Paul, it's just for the transcript, NHBT 5042_058, which says, well, now we're going to look at the second generation testing. So the introduction is deferred pending that. What I wanted to do is just ask you to look at one final document from the contemporaneous decision-making, which sets out Dr. Mehta's perspective as at the end of 1990, NHBT 5061_201. It's Mehta's to Canavan, 18th of December 1990, copied to you, Dr. Pickles and others. We can see, if we just bring up the text of paragraphs 1 to 5 a bit more closely, thank you. We can see that the context is the content of the draft submission that's going to go to ministers to ask for endorsement of the ACVSB's recommendation. And then we can see here Dr. Mehta's take upon the committee's decision-making. Paragraph 2, he says the committee in July reached the conclusion that HCV screening could prevent a significant proportion of post-transfusion hepatitis. Then paragraph 3, he says, furthermore, the committee's view is that with the existence of the current test procedures, to continue a policy of not screening poses an unacceptable risk to the health of recipients of blood and plasma. Paragraph 6, committee recognised the detailed cost benefits could not be quantified. Nevertheless, their unanimous conclusion is that the UK should follow the lead of an increasingly long list of countries who've now introduced HCV screening in order to significantly reduce the load of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis. And then he asks that the submission must convey those points more clearly. Now, Dr. Metis is writing there in what might be thought to be quite strong terms about what's regarded by him as the committee's view, it would seem shared by him as chair of the committee, that the status quo posed an unacceptable risk to the health of recipients. And yet, notwithstanding that, the ACVSB essentially say, well, we'll look at the second generation tests, and testing is not introduced for a further 9 months or so. Do you recall whether that was something which was then troubling Dr. Metis in the course of 1991? Was there concern at how long things were taking to get to the actual stage of introducing it?
Well, I think what you need to do is you need to look at the list of copy recipients of this minute. Right. You have Mr. Heppel, who was the Deputy Secretary, so that means a grade 2 on the administrative side. Dr. Walford, who at that stage presumably was the medical director in the management executive in Leeds. Mr. Malone Lee, who I think he was also a DepSec, or at least a grade 3, if not. Then Mr. Dobson was the AS, Dr. Pickles, myself. Mr. Anderson was the person who was involved in the cost-benefit analysis, so he was from the finance people. So, sorry, or EOR, sorry, not finance, the economic appraisal people. So he obviously, this minute is sent to the great and the good, so to speak. So this is copied to people high up in the administrative and medical hierarchy within DH and the management executive. So he is there basically saying to Mr. Canavan, look, you need to beef up this bit of the submission to stress this, stress that, or whatever. And I think that will be my reading of it, is that Mr. Canavan presumably sent him You see, what was the date of that committee meeting, the ACVSB, in November the 18th or something?
It was the 21st of November.
So, you know, this is actually going quite quickly, isn't it? Because if Mr. Canavan has already prepared a draft submission before the 18th of December, and in fact I think the final submission went on the 21st of December, it was actually put in place pretty quickly for a submission, because sometimes submissions take quite a long time. And I think the thing is here, Dr. Metters is just saying to Mr. Canavan, look, we need to make sure that ministers have absolutely no doubt that this is what we must do.
My question to you, Dr. Rejman, is not about so much the interpretation of this or the speed of the submission. It's trying to reconcile what we see said here in strong terms by Dr. Metters with what we know happened as a matter of fact, which was it took a number of further months before testing was introduced. And my question to you is, do you recall, you've told us about having regular interactions with Dr. Metters. Do you recall this being a subject for concern? Dr. Metters expressing frustration, how long it was taking, anything of that kind?
I honestly cannot remember. I mean, to say, reading through the papers, I suspect that people within the department were not happy with the fact that it was taking as long as it did. But having said that, I think people recognised that we live in the real world. It's a case of what actually can be done, and ultimately, you know, we're in the hands. We are not the people running the transfusion service. We are not in a position to be able to say to the transfusion service, you've got to drop that, drop that, drop that, do this, this is your priority. Because obviously the transfusion service was very busy anyway. I don't think there's any, you know, nobody was sort of sitting on their hands doing nothing. They were very busy with all sorts of things. And here you're giving them another task, which is a significant task, because this was something that I think took 2.5 or 3 hours or something like this to test. It wasn't a sort of, you know, just a dip it in. It's not a, you know, pregnancy test for that side. You know, this is a serious test that requires time and effort, requires people, requires good quality assurance and everything. You know, there's a whole gamut of things involved in introducing a test. So I think we in the department, ideally, we'd have wanted it done the next day. In an ideal world, but you can't because it's of practicalities.
When Dr. Lloyd at Newcastle did introduce the test earlier than other centres, consternation was expressed certainly by some other regional transfusion directors. You wrote a memo to Dr. Metters about it, NHBT 5062_054. And we can see there, paragraph 2 refers to the introduction of screening in Newcastle. You say in paragraph 3 it was despite the agreed policy by the ACVSB that it should be simultaneous. Paragraph 5 refers to problems in terms of the other major competitor company and problems in Scotland. And then paragraph 7, you say you're copying this to members of the management executive to determine whether action is required where an individual region decides to oppose a universal agreement. Were you irritated by, concerned by, troubled by Dr. Lloyd's decision to introduce testing early?
Well, I think here I'm reporting. Well, you see, I'm enclosing. The only way that I knew about this was Harold Gunson had written to John Canavan, and I think this actually illustrates the fact that John Canavan may have had more. Well, the administrators had more. Well, not control, but they were much more involved in the operation of the transfusion centres. I wasn't. That was operational. That was nothing to do with me at all. That was not medical. So therefore, anything operational from the transfusion centres would go to him. Medical things would come to me. this was an operational matter, which is why Dr. Gunson wrote to Mr. Canavan. Now, you could have said, well, Mr. Canavan could have written to Dr. Metters, which presumably he could have done. But for whatever reason, I was asked by John Canavan, could you write to Dr. Metters and say, look, Dr. Gunson is quite concerned about this development. And basically, the rest of what is said there is administrative. It's nothing, there's nothing medical there.
My question is, did you have a view? And if so, what was it?
Well,
you may not have had one.
I can't remember, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure that people would have been upset, whether it's a view or whether it's just been feeling upset, that somebody has
I think the question was about your view, not about other people's views.
I can't tell you. I cannot recall. All that I can intimate, all that I can guess from the way that the papers have been presented to me is that there was general upset within the department, and I suspect that that would have incorporated me, but I cannot recall what I said or felt at the time. Here I am reporting to Dr. Metters, and everything in there is nothing medical remotely there. This has all come from Mr. Canavan, who could just as easily have written the minutes to Dr. Metters, and I don't know why he asked me to do it, or whether he felt...
I'm sorry to cut you short, but I think you've answered Councillor's question.
Yes, thank you.
If we move then to September 1991, the tests are introduced, and then you're sent a copy of a paper intended for publication by Dr. Gunson at WITN 4486065. I just want to look, so we can see the date of it, 3rd of September. We can see Dr. Gunson's asked Dr. Garson to send you a copy of the latest draft of the paper intended for publication. Can we look at the handwriting, please? It's not your handwriting.
It's definitely not me.
But it refers to
may
you.
have been John Canavan's. I don't know. I mean, so I say they'd copied John Canavan, so that may be him. Rutherford was the HEO, I think, at that stage after David Burridge, and it's not my writing anyway.
What I want to do is just see what's written here and then look at the
Yes.
letter you then subsequently wrote, or yes, the letter you wrote. So Dr. Rejman is minuting Dr. Metters about this. MDD...
Which is procurement. Well, in fact, that's Medical Devices Directorate, which is the successor to Procurement Directorate.
Have picked up some technical, that might be inaccuracies. In addition, it doesn't give DH sufficient credit as, and then that might say sponsoring the evaluation,
Yes.
something along that line. It also, and I'm not sure what the rest of it says, but in any event, what I wanted to ask you, or ask you about in a moment when we look at another document.
No, sorry, it says there, if I could, it did something, but supplementary tests were always available. So I think which they weren't. So I think he's there talking about, because I think in the paper they talk about supplementary tests, but they don't actually mention that these are only available at a later stage.
In any event, this appears to be a note saying you're going to minute Dr. Metters.
I think it also makes it appear, looks like the wording.
Yes, I think you're right, sir.
But that supplementary tests were always available, which is not the case.
Yeah, thank you.
So the suggestion there is that this draft paper isn't giving the Department of Health sufficient credit as sponsors of the evaluation. Can we then pick it up with your letter to Dr. Gunson about the paper, NHBT 5015_117, 11th of September 1991, you to Dr. Gunson. You talk about the paper and refer to anxieties, that there were several changes needed in the paper, some of which were simply to correct inaccuracies, and I don't need to ask you about any of those, Dr. Rejman, while others might prevent misinterpretation, which is often very relevant in these litigious times. And then you say you've discussed the paper with Mr. Canavan, Mr. Fuller, and you give below some of our anxieties. And I just want to ask you about really what's said in paragraph 3. The final sentence in the first paragraph of the introduction could be read as being critical of the UK for not introducing screening of blood donations earlier. And so we feel that the beginning of the third paragraph of the introduction on page 4 should be amended to defend our position, and then you set out a suggested new paragraph, and then over the page there are some other suggestions that are made. I'm not going to go through the detail of them. If we just go back to that first page. What business was it of the Department of Health to try and get amended a publication by the Director of the National Blood Transfusion Service, Dr. Gunson, so as to avoid criticism of the decision-making process?
Well, I obviously discussed this with John Canavan, who was obviously the administrator involved. Mark Fuller was from PDD, so that was his contribution was about the deficiencies from about REBA 1 and REBA 2, etc. I think that the two things, this paper was actually reporting on evaluations that had actually been funded by the department. This was not as though we'd actually paid for this. For the work that was being reported in this paper was paid for by the department. So we owned it financially. And as you know, with commercial companies, if they actually pay people to do research, there's usually some agreement about what the person writing the final paper can say about the company. They're usually told you cannot criticize the company, and and then there are debates about how much they are allowed to say. Now, I'd have to read again that final sentence. Have you got it there with you?
The text of the report, yes, it's the
draft.
The draft is at WITN 4486065. If you go to, I'm afraid I don't know what paragraph you were referring to. The introduction starts on page 4. The last sentence of that first paragraph reads, despite these doubts concerning specificity, blood transfusion services in many countries have introduced the assays for screening donations. So you wanted that taken out?
Yes, well, actually reading that, in essence, and in fact, Dr. Gunson did agree in his reply to me that in fact, it would be perfectly reasonable to exclude that sentence because it's not a scientific comment remotely. This is supposed to be a scientific paper, and scientific papers usually should not make commentaries on policy or other matters. If it is that, then it should be a leader article, or it should be straightforward, a commentary, and people should know that. This is supposed to be a scientific paper reporting the results of tests.
With respect, Dr. Rejman, that's not the reason you give in your letter to Dr. Gunson. The reason you give is it could be subject to misinterpretation, we could be criticised.
Well,
these are litigious times.
Yes, well, I'm basically just, because see, Dr. Gunson is one of the co-authors of this paper. He's not the main author, he is a co-author. And what I'm saying there is, and when I talk about defending our position, I don't know, but I suspect it may well have been that I wasn't defending the department's position only, but also the position of the blood transfusion service, because obviously the blood transfusion service was very much tied into the decision-making about the timing of the HCV testing. So Dr. Gunson agreed with me that it was an unnecessary sentence. Obviously, I didn't actually. See, I think the thing is, if you're writing a letter to somebody, you can spend a lot of time going through every single little bit. But I suspect that I was just there highlighting, look, this sentence is a problem. Do you think that we need it?
Dr. Rejman, you've set out in your witness statement in some detail in paragraph or section 73 and indeed in other places within your statement, and I'm talking about the third statement, your perspective on the decision-making process in terms of how long it took and the comparison with other countries. And I'm not going to go through that because, frankly, we simply don't have time, and you've dealt with it in some detail in your statement. I just want to explore with you a couple of broader points, but to do so on the basis of recognising that your statement obviously sets out your perspective. In your statement, in your oral evidence, you've emphasised the position of donors.
Yes.
It might be said, looking at the ACVSB's decision-making process and the department's involvement in that, that in the UK, in contrast to a number of the other countries, it was thought more important to prioritise the well-being of donors than the physical health of the recipients of blood and its components.
No.
Is that a fair comment?
No, that is not a fair comment. I think the way that the department, from my understanding of the way the department looked at this, was obviously the recipient must come number one, because the recipient is the person who is most at risk in any situation where there is a potential for transmitting infection to a patient. So he or she must be the number one priority. But having said that, one has to look at the broader picture of all patients within the health service. And if you have a substantial reduction in the number of donations in the health service, then a lot of people will be disadvantaged. You will not have sufficient to give to everybody what they need.
Was there, as far as you can recall, any attempt at the time, not just to note what other countries were doing, but to try and explore how other countries were going about dealing with these kind of problems and build on those experiences?
Well, I've mentioned in my report to the Penrose, which I quoted in my third statement, I explained that in a number of these other countries, and Professor Leikler, for example, who was the one that was most critical of me, he said that if he had a positive donor, he would just say to them, oh, well, there's, I can't remember the exact words, but basically he was saying, oh, well, there's a problem with your donation. We don't need to do anything about it. Come back next time, and if it's still positive, we'll then think about whether anything needs to be done, which, you know, is not the way that we operate in this, or operated in this country. Some of the other people responsible for blood transfusion in other countries basically said that if they had a positive donation, they would just bin that donation, get rid of it, throw it away, and they would then, if the donor came back 3 months later to give another donation, they wouldn't tell them that we'd had a question mark test over you. They'd just test it again, and if it came back positive again, they'd do the same thing again. So the donor at no stage was told that there was the potential that they might have a serious illness. They obviously felt, and when I discussed this with them, it was quite obvious that they were very wary that anything that was said that would damage donor confidence, they just didn't want to do. So, you know, that was how it operated, and I've actually quoted that in my third statement.
Can I move then to the question of look back,
yes,
which we can take, I think, much more shortly. Early 1995 was when it was announced that there would be a national look back, yes, in relation to hepatitis C. And that followed discussions in what was the successor to ACVSB, the yes, Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissues. Would it have been open to the department to decide that there should be a national look back before that?
Well, I think the reasons why the look back was started when it was first of all, by that stage, we were more certain of the tests and the validity of the tests. Probably the crucial points were that the feasibility of a look back had been demonstrated, because in Scotland, I can't remember whether it's in Edinburgh or wherever, they had actually done a pilot of a look back, and they had said that having done it, they could actually say that it should probably work and work well. And also, about this time, we had a licensed treatment for hepatitis C. So therefore, if you found that a recipient was positive, you had something to offer them apart from telling them, look, you're hepatitis C positive and that is it. So therefore, I think those were the those were the main thing. I've actually obviously put them down in detail in my statement, but I think those were the relevant factors at the time. And I think one of the points that is worth bearing in mind is that Patricia Hewitt, when she wrote to Angela Robinson, I was in this hepatitis C look back working party, and at the beginning of January I sent a fax, which I think I mentioned, to Angela Robinson and to Aileen Keel, and this was an early proposal as to how look back should operate, you know, the various bits, what the responsibilities would be of GPs, consultants who'd been involved in the transfusion, everything else. And Dr. Robinson had sent my fax, copies of it, to various transfusion directors, and I think I've mentioned in my statement 3 of these there. And one of them was from Patricia Hewitt from North London Transfusion Centre, and in it she mentions the HIV look back, which was something that I never knew about prior to this, and it's only recently that I've actually gone through some of the papers that were relevant to it. And Patricia Hewitt, both in her statement to this inquiry and also this was mentioned, I think, at the hearings, refers to the HIV look back. And looking at it, I understand that there was something of a sort of reverse look back initially suggested before HIV testing was available in the blood transfusion service. So it was suggested that anybody with AIDS would be asked, have they ever had a blood transfusion, and to try and do it that way. But then once the HIV blood testing was available, then they very quickly started an HIV look back, but they had major problems with cooperation, particularly from clinicians, because a lot of them said, I don't want to be worrying my patients about this. They've got enough worries on their minds anyway. To tell them that they've got what could be a fatal disease for which we have no treatment was not to their benefit. So I think that those were the main reasons why the look back in HIV was considered a failure.
In terms of lack of effective treatment,
yes,
and then interferon becoming available as a reason for not having done a look back earlier, can I just propose this to you? The fact that there may not have been an effective treatment before then doesn't mean, does it, that there's no point in or benefit in informing people that they have hepatitis C, because there are a range of measures an individual might wish to take: lifestyle choices, alcohol reduction or avoidance, knowing what to look out for, knowing when to seek medical attention, risk of transmission, which, although obviously not of the same magnitude at all as HIV, was not infinitesimally small. All those would be practical advantages to telling people that they had hepatitis C. Was any consideration given, as far as you can recall, to those advantages at any point within the department between 1991 and 1994?
Yes, well, I'd refer you, I honestly don't know this particular reference that well, because it's one that was brought to my attention and actually was mentioned by Dr. Metters. This is the Junger's article about whether you should actually introduce screening if there's no form of treatment. And I think that because Dr. Metters obviously was aware of that particular article. I wasn't at the time, and he actually mentions it in one of his minutes. And the question really is, if there is no effective treatment, it's a case of how much benefit there would be. Now, as you rightly say, sexual transmission is, very, very small in comparison to HIV. How much else will it affect their lifestyle? Probably not much.
Can I just interrupt for a moment? Yes. I think the question was not about your views on the matter, interesting though they are, but about whether there was any discussion in the department, as you remember it, about the benefits of introducing screening earlier than was done, look back earlier than was done.
I'm not sure whether it would have been I cannot recall discussing it, and looking through the papers I can't see any discussion, and I suspect to a large extent this was basically left to the committee, and because it had been mentioned at various times, because it was mentioned right at the beginning by the committee, it was mentioned at various committee meetings, and the fact that the committee kept on saying not yet, not yet, not yet, and I'm not aware of any internal documentation to say that the department said we should be doing this, irrespective of what the committee says.
Can I then just ask you one matter arising out of the MSBT's meeting on the 15th of December 1994, or rather the minutes in relation to that meeting, PRSC 303635. This is the fourth meeting of the MSBT, 15th of December 94. We can see you're present there as a member of the Secretariat. The discussion on Look Back begins on page 5 and continues over onto page 7. And I just want to pick it up on page 7. Paragraph 7.10, we see that the Chief Medical Officer saying an urgent decision was needed on the matters of principle. And then at the bottom of the page, we can see what's said in the minutes to be the advice of the committee to ministers, the first of which is, in the committee's view, there's a duty of care towards those infected with hepatitis C as a result of NHS treatment. It follows that procedures should be put in place to identify those patients at risk. And then it goes on to talk about some of the detail. Now, those are the final minutes of the meeting on the 15th of December. If we just go to WITN 4486088, we can see that on the day after the meeting, Dr. Metters wrote or drafted a document setting out the decision reached by the MSBT yesterday, and we can see that same terminology of the department having a duty of care towards those infected with hepatitis C. So that's Dr. Metters' narrative of the reasoning of the committee. Can I then ask you to look at DHSC 303544_075? You wrote a memo 16th of December, so that same day as Dr. Metters, and we can see you're referring, which it looks like it had been provided to you by Mr. Schofield. But anyway, you say thank you for your minute of earlier today. And then in terms of the wording, paragraph 44, you say the Secretary of State's duty of care in respect of individuals has not been tested. You refer to the HIV haemophilia litigation.
Sorry, which
paragraph 4.
Paragraph 4, thank you.
And you say the main trial never happened. And then you suggest alternative wording that you say might be more appropriate on the assumption that the NHS has responsibility towards those infected. Why did you think it's appropriate to try and change the reasoning that the MSBT had, according to Dr. Metters' note,
well, I think
that had been the basis for the MSBT's decision?
Well, the MSBT decision talked about a duty of care. It didn't say who had that duty of care, and also the MSBT is not a legal body, and I don't think we had any lawyers on the MSBT, therefore they were probably unaware of the sensitivities of talking about a duty of care. I mean, say they talked about it in a general, layman's terminology of duty of care, whereby, they're saying, yes, we have a duty of care, we should look after these people, look after these people, as opposed to any legal niceties. Here, and in fact, you would have noticed on that minute from Dr. Metters that I had actually scrawled on the left-hand side there, that this needs solicitors to look at, because having been involved in the HIV haemophilia litigation, Dr. Metters obviously was aware of it, but he wasn't as closely involved as I was, and therefore I had been aware that this had been a subject that had been raised on more than one occasion during the litigation, and I'm not even sure whether the haemophilia solicitors may have actually, I'm not sure whether they raised it, but anyway, it was raised on a number of occasions. Therefore, I thought this was something that we needed to make sure, particularly if there was going to be, and the likelihood was that there was going to be some sort of press notice, so as to make sure that the wording in anything that came out of the department was appropriate.
But it wasn't appropriate, was it, to change the reasoning or suggest a change to the reasoning of the MSBT? You might think it was poor reasoning, you might disagree with the reasoning, but if that was their reasoning, that is what should be reflected in the minutes, should it not?
Yes, but I think the question really, in fact, is you would have to ask them when you're, and I think in the minutes you will see that Dr. Metters there refers, and I think in my minute I say there that Dr. Metters, or somewhere I referred to Dr. Metters in those minutes, he actually refers to lawyers deciding about this aspect. And I'd have to check exactly where in my statement I've put it, but in fact I did actually, if you look in the minutes of that meeting, I can't remember which paragraph it is, Dr. Metters actually refers to lawyers.
Well, we can check that, no doubt. Just finally, in relation then to Look Back, you were involved, I think, from the department's perspective with the implementation of the Look Back. Obviously, it wasn't being done by the department. And I think I can probably ask you this quite simply and to get it out as a matter of record without going through the detail. But you produced, I think, a series of minutes or communications in late 1995, early 1996, which recorded that the Look Back was taking longer than predicted, and you used the phrase not being pursued with enough vigour. Did the department take any particular steps to try and improve or speed up the process that you can recall?
Yes, well, I think there's a minute which actually gives several options about how... See, I think the point was with the Look Back, people had said, oh, well, we'll probably have this number of patients. And in fact, the number of patients that were identified, I think, were significantly smaller than the numbers that had been predicted. And people were aware that there were problems with the Look Back, and I think I'd have to look through all the papers, but there is a paper which actually gives options. Well, first of all, it talks about the problems, and I think the problems were things like counselling, and I can't remember what the other, there were a whole string of problems, and there were two that were particularly important, and there was a submission to Minister about this, and saying that these are the problems and these are the suggested remedies, and the suggested remedies came both from the MSBT and from the Blood Transfusion Service. So that was all put together in a submission to the Minister, and saying to the Minister, is he happy? Because I think one of the options that was suggested was that we completely scrap Look Back, completely, and just basically say to people, if you had a blood transfusion, come along and have a hepatitis C test. And that was decided that that was not appropriate. So there was a lot of discussion about it.
So I note the time. I've still got some questions of my own for Dr. Rejman, and there's also going to need to be, obviously, the opportunity, probably quite a long opportunity for core participants to suggest questions. I could keep going now, but I'd say I've certainly got another half an hour, even with the best use of my red pen.
Yes, well, let me offer the choice to Dr. Rejman. Doctor, the position is that at some stage there has to be when Council has finished her questions to you, yes, a break. Yes. You may have picked this up if you've been watching any of the inquiry processes, so that those who are core participants can put questions to Council for her to ask you after the break. And they are participant in this inquiry and must be given that opportunity. Yes. So that takes time. Yes. The choice is between having a break now, 20 minutes, let's say, and then Council goes on for half an hour, and then there'll be another break for half an hour, probably, maybe longer, because there may be a number of questions. Yes. And then going on, we're already getting fairly late in the evening. Yes. So the choice is yours, really. If you want a break now, you can certainly have one. Yes. But if you'd rather soldier on, if I can put it that way, then we've got about half an hour or so before we'll have an extended break, probably 30, 40 minutes, and come back for what I would imagine would be the final session. I couldn't promise you how long that'll be. Yes.
Well, no, I think that it's probably better to let's finish what we're doing now, because obviously it allows Council to continue and finish.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Rejman, I want to ask you next, without, I think, on this topic going to any particular document, about hepatitis C financial support. So we've looked at the haemophilia litigation, we've looked at the, more briefly at the establishment of what became the Eileen Trust. It's right, I think, that throughout the 1990s, but probably particularly acute in 1994, 5 and 6, the question of whether to provide compensation or financial support to those infected with hepatitis C was raised through a number of different means, and it was raised on behalf of people with haemophilia, and not least by the Haemophilia Society. It was raised by MPs and so on, but also the question of financial support for those infected with hepatitis C through blood transfusions. Now, I know we provided you with a number of documents, but there are probably other witnesses with whom I can explore this in more depth. So I'm going to take it quite shortly, just to this end. There are discussions about what a scheme might look like, but ultimately, during the period of time that you were at the Department of Health, is this right? It remained the department's position that it was not going to provide, whether it be called compensation or any form of financial support to those infected with hepatitis C.
Reading, yes, and reading through the minute papers, that I seem to think was the case.
Yes, and you're copied into various documents relating to that. Yes. But as I say, I think I can pick that up with other witnesses, and you're largely, I think, a recipient of those communications rather than the author of them.
Yes, because I think, in a sense, you see, that was not a medical decision, and in a sense, it was basically administrators who were looking at the advantages or disadvantages of having some sort of scheme, and they were then recommending to ministers, and ministers were on a number of occasions asked whether they were content with the current situation or whether they wanted to change anything. And obviously it was up to a minister. If a minister felt strongly that the amount of number of MPs that had been asking about this or pursuing this justified a change, then obviously the minister would then make that decision.
But although you were not perhaps the most active player in that debate, you did have a role in on the department's behalf in relation to hepatitis C litigation. Yes. Either litigation that was anticipated or actual litigation that was ongoing in the course of the mid-90s. And I want to pick up on a handful of points relating to that. If we could start with DHSC 6352_081. So this is a minute dated the 12th of April from Mr. Schofield to you. It refers to some a chronology that you've provided and so on, which we'll come back to when we look at the issue of what happened to some of the documents. But I wanted to ask you first of all about paragraph 3. Mr. Schofield says that we, and that's you and him,
yes,
agreed it would be helpful if Sol B4, so that's the relevant part of the solicitor's office, CAOPU, that's the branch to which you now belong,
yes,
and or about to belong, and yourself agreed the rules, in quotation marks, for discovering, in quotation marks, relevant papers. Now, what does that refer to, and what was agreed in terms of those rules?
Well, I'm not sure whether there were any rules as such agreed. I think, in essence, because these, I'm not sure whether they'd already had some writs or something, it was decided that discovery needed to be provided. And there were a number of minutes between me and various other people about, you know, how, should I be providing this discovery, who's supposed to be doing it, and how much discovery and what discovery did they want. And I think that the final upshot was these papers in, I think it was early June of 1995, where I gave those lists of hepatitis C discovery 1989 to 1991, which you should have. And I think, I'm not sure, as I say, there were all sorts of discussions backwards and forwards, and I recall there was 1 minute from Dr. Metters actually instructing me to do this work, because I think I'd actually said, look, I'm busy doing other work. How important is this? And Dr. Metters actually wrote back to say, you have to make this your top priority.
Sorry, sir, I understand that the stenographers are asking for a break. So I think we are going to have to take a break. Perhaps I can just finish the question in relation to this document and then take a break.
Yes.
But the message has come through that the stenographers need a rest, which is entirely understandable. Can I then, I'm sorry to have interrupted you, yes. But I think we'll pick up some of those points on another topic. If we just look at this document and then take a break. Next page, paragraph 10. And I wanted to ask your observations on paragraphs 10 through to 12. So paragraph 10, bottom of the page, Mr. Schofield says this: as I understand it, our worry is as much about what might come out in the course of a court action as the actual verdict, and I suggest, therefore, that any examination of documents should be addressed as much to their presentational significance as to the case for negligence itself. And then he goes on to set out his perspective on the decision-making process in relation to hepatitis C screening, including a concern that there was inordinate administrative or bureaucratic delay, and that's the next page, paragraph 12. I'm not going to ask you about the substance of his concerns about the screening process, because we've addressed that. But it's that point in paragraph 10, our worry is as much about what might come out in the course of a court action as the actual verdict. Do you recall that being part of your discussion with Mr. Schofield? Was that your concern?
I don't know. You see, I suspect Roger Schofield just giving a view that it would be nice if the discovery only gave a good impression of what the department was doing. Now, obviously, Mr. Schofield, with the best will in the world, Mr. Schofield wasn't there at the HIV haemophilia litigation, so I think you have to remember that. And therefore, he is making these comments without actually having had the benefit of knowing what happened then. And if he had been around then, he would have known discovery is what it means. That means all the documents you have that may be relevant are in the discovery. There's no choosing, these are nice, those are less good for our case, therefore they're not discovered. And I suspect that, you know, if he had gone back to this and read it again, I suspect he may well have revised what he said.
So I think in light of the stenographer's request, we must take a break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break then until 5 to 4.
Thank you.
So it's a 20-minute break, slightly shorter in view of the situation.